Mary Lennox was a sour and unpleasant little girl. She had been born in India, where her parents, wealthy and self-absorbed, hardly paid her any attention. They were far too busy with parties and social life to care about their pale, thin daughter. Mary was often left in the care of servants, who spoiled her to keep her quiet but never loved her. This neglect made Mary selfish, demanding, and unkind. When Mary was 9 years old, a tragedy changed her life forever. A terrible outbreak of cholera swept through the household, leaving death and silence in its wake. When it was over, Mary found herself completely alone. Her parents were gone, as were the servants who had always attended to her. Mary was sent to England to live with her uncle, Archibald Craven. He lived at Misselthwaite Manor, a vast and gloomy estate in the Yorkshire moors. Mary had never been to England before, and the idea of moving to such a strange place filled her with a mix of curiosity and dread. When Mary arrived at Misselthwaite, she was met by Mrs. Medlock, the stern housekeeper. "This is no place for a child," Mrs. Medlock said as they rode to the manor. "It's dark and quiet, and Master Craven is rarely home. He prefers to travel and avoid this house." Mary didn't care much. She wasn't looking for company. She had spent most of her life alone and didn't know how to be around others. The manor was just as gloomy as Mrs. Medlock had described. Its long hallways were lined with closed doors, and the rooms seemed lifeless. Only the sound of the wind on the moors broke the silence. Mary's room was cold and plain, and she didn't like it. She demanded that the servants bring her things to make it more comfortable, but her requests were ignored. She soon realized that life at Misselthwaite Manor would be very different from the pampered life she had led in India. The next morning, Mary woke up to find a maid named Martha cleaning her room. Martha was a cheerful young woman with a Yorkshire accent that Mary found strange. "Th's up early," Martha said with a smile. "It's good for thee to get out on the moor. Fresh air does wonders for the soul." Mary frowned. "The moor? What is it?" "It's the open land all around us," Martha explained. "It's wild and free, with heather and gorse as far as the eye can see." Mary wasn't sure she liked the sound of the moor, but she was curious. She had spent so much of her life indoors that the thought of wandering outside seemed almost exciting. Martha encouraged her. "Go explore. The fresh air will put some color in thy cheeks." Reluctantly, Mary put on her coat and went outside. The moor was unlike anything she had ever seen. It stretched endlessly, with no trees or houses, just low plants and the occasional bird. The wind was brisk and carried a faint scent of earth and flowers. As Mary walked, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The open space and silence soothed her, and she found herself wanting to explore more. One day, while wandering in the gardens near the manor, Mary noticed an old man with a spade. He was digging in the dirt and muttering to himself. "Who are you?" Mary asked boldly. The man looked up, startled. "I'm Ben Weatherstaff," he said gruffly. "And who might ye be?" "I'm Mary Lennox," she replied. Ben grunted. "I, the little miss from India. You don't look like much." Mary didn't take offense. She was more interested in the robin that was hopping around near Ben. "That robin likes me," Ben said with a rare smile. "He's a clever little thing. He knows when someone means no harm." Mary watched the robin with fascination. It seemed unafraid of her, flitting close enough that she could see its bright red chest. She decided she liked the bird. Mary's daily walks became her favorite part of life at Misselthwaite. The fresh air and the quiet gave her a sense of freedom she had never known before. One afternoon, while exploring, she noticed something unusual: a high stone wall covered in ivy. "What's behind that wall?" she asked Martha later. "That's the garden," Martha said. "It's been locked up for 10 years. Why?" Mary asked, intrigued. Martha hesitated. "It belonged to Mistress Craven, Master Craven's wife. She loved that garden, but after she passed away, he locked it up and buried the key. No one's been inside since." Mary felt a spark of curiosity. A locked garden sounded mysterious and exciting. She wondered what it looked like and whether anything still grew inside. As the days passed, Mary couldn't stop thinking about the garden. She decided she had to find a way inside. One windy day, as Mary walked near the stone wall, the robin appeared again. It chirped and fluttered, as if trying to get her attention. "What is it?" Mary asked, following the bird. The robin led her to a patch of ivy at the base of the wall. There, half hidden in the dirt, Mary saw something shiny. She bent down and picked it up. It was an old key. Mary's heart raced. Could this be the key to the locked garden? She looked around to make sure no one was watching, then slipped the key into her pocket. That night, Mary lay awake, thinking about the key. She felt a strange excitement bubbling inside her. For the first time in her life, she had a secret, something that belonged to her alone. She couldn't wait to see what lay behind the garden door. The next morning, Mary woke up earlier than usual, her thoughts still focused on the mysterious key in her pocket. The idea of discovering the locked garden filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. After breakfast, she put on her coat and boots and headed outside, determined to find the door that matched the key. The robin appeared as she walked near the wall again, chirping and hopping from branch to branch. "Are you trying to help me?" Mary asked, half amused. The robin fluttered ahead, pausing near a section of the wall where the ivy grew thick and tangled. Mary inspected the wall carefully. Beneath the ivy, she noticed the faint outline of a door. Her heart skipped a beat. This had to be it, the entrance to the locked garden. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. She brushed the ivy aside and found the keyhole. Slowly, she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the heavy door creaked open. What she saw took her breath away. Inside, the garden was quiet and overgrown. Vines climbed the stone walls, and weeds had spread across the ground. But despite the neglect, Mary could see signs of life. Tiny green shoots poked through the soil, and here and there, small clusters of flowers bloomed bravely in the sunlight. Mary stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a moment, she stood still, taking it all in. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the sound of birdsong echoed softly around her. "This is my garden now," she whispered to herself. Mary spent the rest of the morning exploring every corner of the garden. She found an old bench covered in moss and a broken fountain with water trickling faintly from its spout. The trees were bare, but their branches stretched gracefully toward the sky. She knelt down and touched the soil. It felt cool and soft under her fingers. "I think I can bring this garden back to life," she thought. But Mary knew she couldn't do it alone. She didn't know much about plants or gardening. The only person who might help her was Ben Weatherstaff, but she wasn't sure if he could be trusted with her secret. That evening, Mary spoke to Martha again. "Tell me more about the garden," she said casually, trying not to reveal that she had already found it. Martha sighed. "It was beautiful once, full of roses and flowers of every color. Mistress Craven loved it more than anything. She used to spend hours there, planting and caring for the flowers." "What happened to her?" Mary asked. "She had an accident," Martha explained. "One day, while she was in the garden, a tree branch broke, and she fell. She died soon after, and Master Craven was so heartbroken that he locked the garden and buried the key. He couldn't bear to see it anymore. Mary felt a pang of sadness. She could imagine how much the garden must have meant to Mistress Craven. It made her even more determined to restore it. The next day, Mary went back to the garden. She brought a small trowel she had found in a storage room and began pulling out weeds. It was hard work, but Mary didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was doing something meaningful. As she worked, she began to notice small changes. The soil smelled richer, and tiny buds began to appear on the branches of the trees. The garden seemed to be waking up, as if it had been waiting for someone to care for it again. The robin often kept her company, flitting around and chirping as she worked. Mary felt as though the little bird were her only friend, but she didn't feel lonely. The garden filled her with a sense of peace and belonging. One afternoon, as Mary was digging near the fountain, she heard a voice behind her. "What are you doing here?" She turned to see Ben Weatherstaff standing in the doorway. His expression was a mix of surprise and disapproval. Mary hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell the truth. "I found the key," she said. "I wanted to see what was inside. This garden is beautiful, even though it's wild and overgrown. I want to bring it back to life." Ben's stern face softened. "So, ye found it, did ye?" he said quietly. "I thought no one would ever come here again. Will you help me?" Mary asked. Ben scratched his head. "It's been a long time since anyone cared for this place. But if you're serious about it, I'll show ye how to start." Relieved, Mary nodded. She knew that with Ben's help, she could do much more for the garden. Over the next few weeks, Ben taught Mary how to prune the bushes, turn the soil, and plant new seeds. She worked harder than she ever had in her life, but she didn't mind. The garden began to change before her eyes. The grass grew greener, the trees sprouted new leaves, and the flowers started to bloom. Mary found herself changing too. She wasn't as sour or selfish as she had been before. The fresh air and hard work gave her energy, and she even started to feel a little happy. Martha noticed the difference. "They's lookin' brighter, Miss Mary," she said one morning. "The moor must be good for thee." Mary didn't tell her about the garden, but she smiled and said, "I think it is." One evening, as Mary lay in bed, she heard a strange sound coming from somewhere in the house. It was faint, but it sounded like someone crying. She sat up and listened carefully. The sound was coming from a faraway room. Mary had always been told not to wander through the manor, but her curiosity got the better of her. She decided to follow the sound. Tiptoeing down the long hallways, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She passed door after door until she came to one that was slightly ajar. Inside, she saw a small boy lying in bed. He looked pale and frail, with dark hair and sad eyes. He was crying softly into his pillow. "Who are you?" Mary asked, stepping into the room. The boy turned to her, startled. "I'm Colin," he said. "Who are you?" "I'm Mary. I've come to live here with my uncle," she replied. "Why are you crying?" "Because I'm going to die," Colin said matter-of-factly. Mary frowned. "That's nonsense. You don't look like you're going to die." Colin stared at her, surprised by her bluntness. "Everyone says I'm too weak to live. They don't let me go outside, and I'm always sick." Mary didn't know what to say. She had never met anyone like Colin before, but something about him intrigued her. "I don't think you'll die," she said finally. "But you'll never get better if you stay cooped up in this room all the time." Colin blinked, as if the idea had never occurred to him. Mary returned to Colin's room the next day, determined to find out more about her strange cousin. Colin was curious about her too, though he tried to hide it behind his bossy demeanor. "Where have you been all this time?" Colin asked, his voice sharp but his expression eager. "This house is enormous, and I've never seen you before." "I've been outside," Mary replied. "The fresh air is good for you, you know." Colin frowned. "I can't go outside. The doctors say I'm too weak. If I catch a chill, I could die." Mary crossed her arms. "I think that's nonsense. You look pale and weak because you're always in this dark room. You need sunshine and fresh air, just like the plants in the garden." "The garden?" Colin's eyes lit up with interest. "What garden?" Mary hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about her secret garden except for Ben Weatherstaff. But something about Colin's sad, lonely face made her want to share it with him. "There's a locked garden on the estate," she said finally. "I found the key and went inside. It was overgrown and wild, but I've been working on it. It's starting to come back to life." Colin sat up straighter, his pale face brightening. "You found a secret garden? I've heard the servants whisper about it, but I thought it was just a story." "Can I see it?" Mary looked at him critically. "If you're strong enough to walk, I'll take you. But you have to promise to keep it a secret." Colin's excitement quickly turned to frustration. "I can't walk," he snapped. "My legs are too weak." Mary didn't believe him. "Have you even tried?" she asked. Colin glared at her, but the challenge in her voice sparked something in him. "If you help me, I'll try," he said finally. The next morning, Mary enlisted the help of Martha and a kind-hearted servant named Dickon, who was Martha's younger brother. Dickon was a boy with a natural love for animals and plants, and Mary trusted him immediately. "Colin wants to see the garden," Mary explained to Dickon. "But he says he can't walk. Can you help me get him there?" Dickon nodded. We'll manage. I've a way with animals and people alike." Together, they found a small wheelchair to bring Colin outside. When Mary told Colin about the plan, he looked both excited and terrified. "What if something happens to me?" he asked nervously. "Nothing will happen," Mary said firmly. "You're not as weak as you think you are." It was a sunny morning when Mary and Dickon wheeled Colin out of the manor for the first time in years. The sunlight made him squint, and the cool breeze sent a shiver through him, but he felt a rush of exhilaration. "It's so bright," he said softly, looking around at the sprawling moors. "I didn't know it would feel like this." Mary smiled. "Wait until you see the garden." The robin appeared as they approached the hidden door, chirping happily as if welcoming Colin to the secret place. Mary used the key to unlock the door, and together, they wheeled Colin inside. Colin gasped as he looked around. The garden was alive with color and light. Flowers were blooming, the grass was green, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and blossoms. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Dickon helped Colin out of the wheelchair and onto a soft patch of grass. Can sit here for a while," Dickon said gently. "The sun will do thee good." Colin leaned back against the grass, closing his eyes and letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. For the first time in his life, he felt free. As the days passed, Colin grew stronger. Mary and Dickon encouraged him to try walking short distances, and though he stumbled at first, he was determined to succeed. "You're doing it," Mary cheered one afternoon as Colin took his first unsteady steps. "I am," Colin said, laughing with delight. "I can walk." The joy on his face was infectious, and even Mary found herself laughing, a sound she hadn't made in a very long time. The garden became a sanctuary for all three of them. Mary, Colin, and Dickon spent their days working in the soil, planting flowers, and caring for the trees. The robin was a constant companion, flitting around and chirping as if to encourage their efforts. Colin's transformation was remarkable. His pale cheeks grew rosy, his voice became stronger, and his laughter rang through the garden. Even his mood improved. He no longer complained or demanded attention. Instead, he was eager to help and full of gratitude for his newfound strength. "I think the garden is magic," Colin said one day as they rested under a tree. "It's healed me. I feel alive for the first time." "It's not just the garden," Mary said thoughtfully. "It's you. You decided to fight, to get better. The garden gave you a reason, but you did the work." Colin smiled. "Maybe it's both. The garden and us." Word of Colin's improvement began to spread through the manor. The servants, who had always tiptoed around him as if he were a fragile doll, were amazed to see him walking and laughing. Mrs. Medlock, the housekeeper, was so shocked that she nearly dropped her tray of tea when she saw Colin outside one afternoon. "Master Colin," she exclaimed. "What are you doing out here?" "I'm living," Colin said simply. "And I'm not going back to that dark room." As Colin grew stronger, he began to talk about showing the garden to his father, Mr. Craven. "Do you think he'll like it?" he asked Mary one day. Mary hesitated. "I think he'll love it. The garden was his favorite place when your mother was alive. It might bring him some peace." Colin nodded. "Then we'll show him. But not yet. I want him to see it when it's at its best." Under Colin's leadership, the three friends worked harder than ever to make the garden as beautiful as it could be. Every flower they planted and every weed they pulled felt like a step toward something bigger, a place of healing and hope. And all the while, the robins sang, as if celebrating the garden's return to life. Summer arrived, and the garden bloomed with vibrant colors and life. Roses climbed the walls, their fragrant blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. Wildflowers filled the air with sweetness, and the trees provided shade from the warm sun. Mary, Colin, and Dickon had transformed the once-forgotten place into a sanctuary of beauty and joy. Colin grew stronger every day. His walks turned into short runs, and his laughter filled the air as he played with Dickon and the animals that often visited the garden. The robin had become a constant companion, darting between the branches as if keeping watch over their secret. One morning, Colin announced that he was ready to share the garden with his father. Mary and Dickon exchanged nervous glances, but Colin was determined. "It's time," he said firmly. "Father needs to see this place. He needs to know that I'm well, and that the garden is alive again." Far away, in the Swiss Alps, Mr. Archibald Craven was walking through the mountains. He had spent years traveling, unable to face the memories that haunted Misselthwaite Manor. His wife's death had left a hole in his heart, and he had locked away not only the garden but also his own happiness. As he walked, he felt a strange tug in his heart. It was as if something, or someone, was calling him home. "I must return," he thought, though he didn't know why. When Mr. Craven arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, he noticed the change immediately. The servants seemed livelier, the air felt lighter, and there was a sense of hope in the house that hadn't been there for years. Mrs. Medlock met him at the door. "Master Craven," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You won't believe what's happened." "What is it?" he asked, puzzled by her excitement. "It's Master Colin," she said. He's not the boy you left behind." Before Mr. Craven could respond, he heard the sound of laughter coming from outside. It was bright and joyous, and it pulled him toward the gardens. Following the sound, Mr. Craven walked through the estate until he reached the high stone wall covered in ivy. The laughter grew louder as he approached. Pushing the door open, he stepped into the garden, and stopped in his tracks. What he saw took his breath away. The garden was alive, more beautiful than it had ever been. Flowers of every color swayed in the breeze, their petals glowing in the sunlight. The trees were full of leaves, and the grass was soft and green. In the middle of it all stood Colin, his face flushed with health and happiness. "Father," Colin cried, running toward him. "Look, I'm walking, Mr." Craven stared in disbelief as his son wrapped his arms around him. "Colin," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Is it really you?" "Yes, father. I'm well now. The garden made me better," Colin said, beaming. Tears filled Mr. Craven's eyes as he looked around the garden. "I thought this place was lost forever," he said softly. Mary stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "I found the key," she admitted. "I couldn't stay away. The garden seemed too beautiful to leave locked up, Mr." Craven turned to her, his expression full of gratitude. "You've done something wonderful, Mary," he said. "You've brought life back to this place, and to Colin." The days that followed were filled with joy. Mr. Craven spent time in the garden with Colin, Mary, and Dickon, rediscovering the peace and happiness he had lost. He told them stories about his wife, Mistress Craven, and how much she had loved the garden. "She would be so proud," he said one afternoon, his voice full of emotion. "This place was her heart, and now it's alive again. You've given us a gift I can never repay." Colin beamed with pride. "We did it together, Father. Mary and Dickon helped me, and the garden helped all of us." Word of the garden's revival spread through Misselthwaite Manor and beyond. The servants, who had once tiptoed around the silent halls, now laughed and chatted as they worked. The villagers spoke of the change in the Craven family, marveling at Colin's miraculous recovery and the beauty of the garden. Even Mary felt different. The sour, selfish girl who had arrived from India was gone. In her place was a lively, kind-hearted child who had found her place in the world. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Mary sat on the moss-covered bench, watching Colin and Dickon chase the robin through the flowers. Mr. Craven joined her, sitting quietly by her side. "You've done more for this family than you can imagine, Mary," he said. "When you came here, I was lost, and Colin was trapped in darkness. But you brought us back to life." Mary looked at him and smiled. "The garden did most of the work," she said. "I just found the key." As the summer turned to autumn, the garden continued to thrive, a symbol of hope and renewal. Mary, Colin, and Dickon spent every moment they could within its walls, knowing that it was a place of magic and healing. For Colin, it was the start of a new life. No longer the sickly boy confined to his bed, he ran, laughed, and dreamed of the future. For Mary, the garden was a home, a place where she had found love and belonging. And for Mr. Craven, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, life could begin again. The secret garden, once forgotten and locked away, had become a sanctuary for all who entered. It was no longer a place of sorrow but one of joy, growth, and endless possibilities. And as the robin sang from its perch in the tallest tree, it seemed to echo the thoughts of everyone in the garden. Anything was possible when you let the light in.